The morning of May 7, 1957, began like any other in the small town of Hexham, Northumberland, England. The sun filtered gently through the trees, casting its soft light on quiet streets. For the Pollock family, it was supposed to be another peaceful Sunday. Sisters Joanna, 11, and Jacqueline, 6, had gotten dressed in their Sunday best, excited to walk to church. They held hands as they often did, inseparable in spirit and in love. What happened next would change their family forever. As the girls made their way down the familiar path, a car, driven recklessly by a woman under the influence of heavy medication, came speeding around the corner. In an instant, it struck both girls with such force that they died almost immediately. No time for goodbyes, no final words, just silence, a silence that would echo in their parents' hearts for the rest of their lives. John and Florence Pollock, their parents, were thrown into a nightmare they could not wake from. In a single moment, they lost not only their daughters but their sense of purpose, safety, and peace. There's no roadmap for losing a child. It's not just grief, it's a severing of the soul, a type of pain that sits in the bones and never fully leaves. Florence became withdrawn, emotionally shut down. John tried to stay strong, but there were days he could hardly breathe. The house became a museum of memories. Shoes that would never be worn again, toys that would never be played with, laughter that would never return. Each room carried the scent of absence. Even time refused to move forward for them. But in the middle of this unbearable darkness, something unexpected began to happen. John, though devastated, began to feel a strange conviction deep in his spirit, one that most would dismiss as a fantasy born from heartbreak. He believed his daughters would come back to him. He wasn't simply holding on to hope. He knew it in his bones. He believed in reincarnation, a concept often foreign to Christian circles, but one he had quietly studied for years. Despite being a devout man of faith, John didn't believe death was the end. He was convinced that somehow, someway, the souls of Joanna and Jacqueline were not lost. They were just waiting to return. His belief became a source of tension in the marriage. Florence, grounded in grief and Christian doctrine, couldn't accept it. To her, such thinking was dangerous and delusional. The idea of reincarnation was blasphemous, even unthinkable, and yet John stood firm. He wasn't asking for agreement. He simply could not deny the pull in his heart. Their pain, though mutual, began to isolate them. Friends avoided the topic. The town moved on. But for the Pollocks, time had frozen. They were suspended in tragedy, trying to breathe in a world that had no air left for them. When Florence became pregnant less than a year after the accident, it seemed like a miracle, or perhaps a second chance. But what happened next would defy even the strongest skeptic. Florence gave birth to identical twin girls, a rarity in itself, especially since there was no known history of twins in the family. The girls, Gillian and Jennifer, were born healthy and beautiful, and for the first time in a year, the house was filled with baby cries and laughter. Yet behind their joy, the pain still lingered. The memory of Joanna and Jacqueline never faded. But slowly, Florence and John began to feel something new, not just grief, but a strange sense of spiritual continuity. The tragedy that once broke them was beginning to whisper something greater, that life, perhaps, is never truly lost. The death of their daughters had nearly destroyed the Pollocks, but it also awakened a deeper question that lives in every human heart. Is this really the end, or is there more beyond what we can see? The story of the Pollock family isn't just about death or grief. It's about a tragedy that brought a family to its knees, and a father's unwavering belief that there's something beyond this world that even death cannot take away. It's about how the darkest moments of our lives can become the doorway to the most profound mysteries. And it's about how, sometimes, love is so strong, it comes back, in the wake of an unthinkable tragedy. While the world expected him to fall apart, John Pollock stood firm in something very few could understand, an unshakable belief that his daughters would return. After the sudden and devastating accident that took the lives of his two beloved daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline, John found himself not just in mourning, but in deep reflection. While his wife Florence spiraled into grief, John began to sense something that even he couldn't fully explain. There was no doubt he was heartbroken. He had lost two little girls he adored beyond words, but somewhere inside, beyond the pain and the numbness, something stirred in him. an unexplainable conviction that his daughters were not truly gone. This wasn't a coping mechanism. It wasn't denial. John was fully aware of the reality. He had seen their empty beds. He had heard the silence that now echoed through the house where giggles used to ring out. But he had also studied life in his own private way and believed deeply in the possibility of reincarnation. John had long been curious about life after death. Though raised and practicing in the Christian faith, he had explored spiritual writings from around the world. He believed that the soul was eternal and that death was not an end, but a transition. While many around him saw reincarnation as heresy or superstition, John saw it as divine continuation, a mystery of God's design beyond human understanding. So when he told Florence, "I believe the girls will come back to us," it wasn't out of desperation, it was from a place of genuine grounded belief. His conviction only grew stronger with time, and yet this belief would come at a great cost. People ridiculed him, friends distanced themselves, even some members of the local church questioned his sanity. They whispered that grief had cracked his mind, that he was clinging to fantasies because the reality was too painful. But John didn't waver. He didn't need others to believe him. He just needed to hold on to the truth he felt in his spirit. Faith doesn't always need evidence. Sometimes it just needs endurance. Even Florence couldn't accept his belief at first. She was hurting in her own way, and his insistence on reincarnation only deepened the divide between them. To her, it felt like a betrayal of their faith, of their past, and even of their daughter's memory. How could he speak of them coming back when their graves were still fresh in the ground? But John didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply stood firm, quietly, gently. He didn't force his belief. He just lived in it. And then something unexpected happened. Less than a year after the accident, Florence became pregnant again. The doctors told them it was one child, but on the day of delivery, October 4, 1950, 8 identical twin girls were born, Jillian and Jennifer. John wept as he held them, not just with the joy of a father welcoming life, but with the overwhelming sense that his daughters had come home. Though Florence remained skeptical at first, she couldn't deny the unusual signs that followed. Jennifer's birthmarks that matched Jacqueline's scars, the strange behaviors, the memories, the familiarity with places and toys they had never seen. All of it only deepened John's conviction, but he never said, "I told you so." That was never his goal. His belief was never about proving people wrong. It was about keeping his heart open when the world had given him every reason to shut it down. In many ways, John Pollock's belief wasn't just in reincarnation, it was in hope itself. He chose to believe that something good could rise from the ashes, that love could find its way back, that life was more than what could be measured in minutes and miles. His unshakable faith wasn't just about the soul, it was about refusing to surrender to despair. For those of us walking through grief, loss, or unanswered questions, John's story is a powerful reminder that you don't have to see the full picture to believe in something greater. Even when science has no answers, the heart may still know the truth. When everything seems lost, belief can carry us to the other side of sorrow. John's unwavering belief didn't just change his life. It preserved his spirit, healed his family, and inspired the world. 9 months after unimaginable heartbreak, in a small town still haunted by the echo of tragedy, life found its way back into the Pollock household. Following the deaths of their daughters, Joanna 11 and Jacqueline 6, in a horrifying car accident, John and Florence Pollock were left emotionally crippled. Their home, once filled with laughter and the energy of 2 bright young girls, had become a shrine of silence, sorrow, and shattered dreams. Yet despite the darkness, something flickered within John, a hope that refused to die. He clung to his belief in reincarnation, even when others mocked him, when his own wife could barely look at him without tears. John believed his daughters would return. So when Florence discovered she was pregnant less than a year after the accident, it felt like a moment suspended between heaven and earth. For John, it wasn't just new life, it was the beginning of a promise fulfilled. The doctors told them they were expecting one child. The scans showed a single heartbeat. There was no reason to expect anything unusual, but on October 4, 1958, Florence gave birth to twin girls, Gillian and Jennifer. It was the first of many surprises. The birth itself was smooth, but emotionally overwhelming. Florence, still carrying the weight of grief, was shocked. She hadn't anticipated twins. It was extremely rare, especially since there was no family history of twins on either side. For John, however, this was no accident. This was confirmation. He looked at his newborn daughters not as replacements, but as continuations. He believed Joanna and Jacqueline had returned, not in name, but in soul. And though Florence was skeptical, even hesitant to entertain such thoughts, she couldn't help but feel that something extraordinary was unfolding. Then came the second surprise, the birthmarks. Jennifer, the younger of the two, had a small birthmark on her left hip, in the exact location where Jacqueline had a scar from a bicycle accident. Even more unsettling, she had a second mark on her forehead, strikingly similar to a mark Jacqueline had in the same spot. These weren't minor coincidences, they were vivid, undeniable signs. Still, Florence remained quiet, processing everything with caution. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but her once firm resistance to the idea of reincarnation began to soften. She had seen her husband's faith endure through ridicule and silence. Now, part of her began to wonder, was he right all along? As the twins began to grow, so did the list of strange behaviors. From an early age, the girls started asking for toys that belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. They knew their names, they recognized them, even though those toys had been boxed and stored away, never discussed in front of the twins. When they were old enough to walk and speak clearly, they began pointing out landmarks around Hexham that they had never been taken to, but were intimately familiar with. They referred to things Joanna and Jacqueline had known. They spoke about events that had happened before they were born. They even called certain places ours when they had never been there. Even their personalities reflected the sisters they never met. Gillian was more mature, like Joanna. Jennifer was more dependent and affectionate, just like Jacqueline had been. Their mannerisms, speech patterns, and even the games they played bore eerie similarities to the two lost daughters. As a result, what had begun as a mysterious birth turned into a spiritual journey, not just for John, who now stood more convinced than ever, but for Florence, who gradually opened her heart to the impossible. Still, the Pollocks were cautious. They didn't seek fame. They didn't turn their story into a public spectacle. In fact, they tried to shield the twins from outside influence. They didn't want to lead them into these beliefs. They simply observed. And what they observed couldn't be ignored. The birth of the twins didn't erase the pain of losing Joanna and Jacqueline, but it brought a new chapter, one written with wonder, awe, and the kind of hope that defies logic. It's a chapter that reminds us all, even in the shadow of grief, new life can bring light. Even when logic fails, faith can guide us, and sometimes the universe gives us a second chance, not in the way we expect, but in a way that speaks directly to the soul. The birth of Gillian and Jennifer Pollock wasn't just the arrival of two beautiful girls. It was the beginning of a mystery that would challenge science, touch hearts across the world, and breathe healing into a home once defined by loss. By the time Gillian and Jennifer Pollock were 3 years old, their parents, John and Florence, had already begun noticing bizarre and unsettling patterns, similarities that went far beyond coincidence. These weren't just two twin sisters growing up with shared experiences. These were two children who, according to every known law of science and nature, should have had no knowledge of the past, and yet seemed to remember a life they never lived. It began subtly. While playing alone one day, the girls were overheard talking about a car accident. Jennifer, in a frightened voice, said, "The blood is coming out of my eyes. That's where the car hit me." Neither girl had ever been told about the tragic accident that took the lives of Joanna and Jacqueline, their older sisters, who had died more than a year before the twins were born. Florence froze. They had never spoken of the accident in front of the girls. The details had been kept private. The twins were too young to read, too sheltered to know, and yet, somehow, Jennifer described it exactly as it had happened. It wasn't just that. The girls began asking for specific toys that had once belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. They didn't just ask vaguely, they knew the names the deceased sisters had given the dolls and teddy bears. When the toys were taken out of the attic and brought before them, Jillian and Jennifer picked them up as if being reunited with old friends. They knew which toy belonged to which sister. Then came the strange behavior when they were taken on walks through the town of Hexham, the very place where their sisters had lived and died. One day, while walking past a school building neither girl had entered, Jennifer pointed and exclaimed, "That's my school." Jillian added, "We used to play in the yard behind it." They were 3 years old. They had never been enrolled in school, yet they seemed to recognize buildings, streets, and shops that had been part of their sisters' lives. Another time, the twins asked to be taken to the park where their other parents used to take them. Confused and disturbed, John and Florence listened as the girls accurately described the park where Joanna and Jacqueline had spent countless afternoons, a place they had never visited as toddlers. What disturbed Florence the most was a day when Jennifer, while dressing, pointed to a birthmark on her hip and said, "That's where I got hurt." The mark perfectly matched a scar Jacqueline had from a bicycle accident. Jennifer also had a mark on her forehead, in the exact spot where Jacqueline had received a gash after falling. These were not just visual similarities, they were behavioral imprints, deep emotional patterns that mimicked the lives of two girls who no longer walked the earth. Jillian, the elder of the twins, was more mature and responsible, just as Joanna had been. Jennifer, more sensitive and dependent, mirrored Jacqueline. They even played the same games, created similar drawings, and used phrases that their older sisters were known to use, phrases never spoken by their parents. It was as if they were reliving someone else's childhood. The most chilling moment came when the family passed by a car that looked eerily similar to the one that had struck Joanna and Jacqueline. The twins clutched each other in fear and screamed, "The car, it's coming to get us." No one had told them how their sisters had died. Yet their visceral reaction revealed a kind of trauma memory, as if they had experienced it themselves. These strange episodes continued until the girls were about 5 years old. Then, slowly, the memories began to fade. By the time they turned 8, Jillian and Jennifer no longer remembered the incidents, the vivid recollections, the strange knowledge, the terrifying visions, all gone, but their parents never forgot. John felt vindicated. Everything he had believed about reincarnation had been confirmed through his daughters, but for him, this wasn't about being right. It was about knowing that love could not be destroyed by death. Florence, once a skeptic, became a quiet believer. She could no longer deny the reality she had witnessed with her own eyes. This chapter of their lives became a powerful reminder that there is more to life than what we see, more to the soul than we understand, and more to love than even death can contain. Whether reincarnation is real or not, whether science ever catches up to explain it, the mystery of the Pollock twins stands as a beacon of spiritual awe. For those grieving, it offers comfort. For those doubting, it raises questions. For all of us, it tells a story that something deeper is at work in the universe. Memories may fade, but some truths echo beyond time. As the strange memories and chilling behaviors of Jillian and Jennifer Pollock continued to unfold, the story caught the attention of more than just curious neighbors. It began to attract the attention of the scientific world, not because it was a fantasy, but because it was a documented phenomenon that defied every logical explanation. By this point, John and Florence Pollock had already been quietly observing the peculiar knowledge and habits of their twin daughters. The birthmarks, the specific memories, the recognition of places they had never been. These weren't just family stories whispered at the dinner table. They were experiences that called into question everything we think we know about memory, identity, and the soul. While many in their small English town remained skeptical, one man decided to approach the mystery not as a cynic, but as a scientist seeking the truth. Enter Dr. Ian Stevenson, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who spent much of his career studying children who claimed to remember past lives. Unlike many paranormal investigators of his time, Dr. Stevenson was a serious academic, a man of reason, science, and methodical research. When he heard about the Pollock twins, he knew this case was unlike any other. Stevenson traveled to the UK and met with the Pollocks. He interviewed the family multiple times, documenting the twins' statements, observing their behavior, and collecting detailed accounts of what they remembered and when. What he found was both unsettling and profound. He recorded over 30 separate facts that Gillian and Jennifer seemed to know that matched the lives of their deceased sisters, facts that were too specific, too accurate, and too emotionally charged to dismiss as random coincidence or learned behavior. The twins recognized their late sister's toys by name. They recalled events from the sisters' lives in stunning detail, including the location of a playground, names of school teachers, and even the layout of a house they had never seen. Jennifer described the exact circumstances of Jacqueline's car accident injuries. Gillian showed familiarity with places only Joanna had ever visited. These weren't vague impressions or dreams. These were detailed, consistent, and spontaneous recollections from children too young to fabricate such stories, and with no opportunity to learn them. Skeptics tried to explain it away. Some claimed it was cryptomnesia, that the children had somehow absorbed the details through overheard conversations or parental influence. But Florence and John had been intentionally silent about the deaths of Joanna and Jacqueline. They had locked away their belongings, never spoken of the accident in the twins' presence, and made no attempt to suggest the twins were anyone but themselves. Others speculated it was confirmation bias, that John, a believer in reincarnation, was simply seeing what he wanted to see. But Florence had been a skeptic for years, and even she had been forced to admit slowly and painfully that something beyond reason was unfolding in their home. And then came the hardest truth for science. There was no dated, driven answer. Reincarnation, by its nature, is a spiritual and metaphysical belief, one that science struggles to measure because it involves aspects of consciousness, soul, and identity that go beyond the brain's neurons and the body's biology. Dr. Stevenson, despite being a man of science, concluded that the Pollock case was one of the strongest pieces of evidence for reincarnation ever recorded. He didn't claim to fully understand it. He didn't try to sensationalize it. He simply documented the facts and allowed the story to speak for itself. For decades, the Pollock twins case has been cited in books, documentaries, and academic studies as one of the most compelling cases of past life memory ever reported. And yet, even with all the attention, science has never offered a definitive answer. Why would two twins, born into a quiet English town, remember the lives of two dead sisters they had never met? How did Jennifer's birthmarks match the scars of a child who died before she was born? Why did they experience trauma responses to cars identical to the ones that killed Joanna and Jacqueline? Science could measure the twins' brain waves. It could examine their DNA, but it could not explain their memories. Because what they remembered wasn't written in their cells, it was written in their souls, and that is what made this story more than just a mystery. It became a mirror, reflecting something larger than ourselves. A reminder that not everything can be quantified, that there are questions we are still learning how to ask, and that sometimes the most powerful truths are felt before they are proven. The story of the Pollock twins wasn't meant to end with an answer. It was meant to open a door to possibility, a door to wonder, a door to faith in something greater. What began as a quiet tragedy in a small English town would go on to become one of the most mysterious and thought-provoking cases the world has ever seen. But more than just a paranormal story, the tale of the Pollock twins became something greater, a message, one that traveled beyond borders, beyond religion, and beyond logic. A message that touched the hearts of believers and skeptics alike. Because this wasn't just about reincarnation. It was about healing, faith, and the undeniable power of love, a force so profound that not even death could silence it. In the years that followed the public discovery of the twins' strange memories and behaviors, People from all over the world began to hear about the case. From spiritual communities to mainstream media, psychologists to philosophers, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Yet no one had a definitive answer, and perhaps that was the point. What made the story so powerful wasn't that it gave clear conclusions, but that it forced humanity to pause, to question, to wonder. The Pollock twins reminded us all that there are still things in this life and the next that we cannot measure with instruments or define with data, and that mystery isn't something to fear, it's something to respect. For grieving parents around the world, this story gave something that grief so often steals: hope. Imagine losing your child, waking up every day with an ache in your soul, then hearing about a case where a family believed and saw signs that their children had returned. You don't have to believe in reincarnation to feel the weight of that possibility. Just the idea that our loved ones are not truly gone, that maybe, just maybe, their essence lives on, can be the very thing that keeps someone from giving up. That's what the story of Gillian and Jennifer Pollock gave to the world, a reason to keep going. For people of faith, it reinforced the belief that the soul is eternal, that there is more beyond this life. For scientists, it was a challenge, a case that didn't fit neatly into existing theories. For the curious, it was a mystery that invited deeper exploration. For the broken, it was a flicker of light in unbearable darkness. But perhaps the greatest message came through John Pollock himself. Here was a man who held on to a quiet, unwavering belief that his daughters would return. He was ridiculed, mocked, even doubted by his own wife. Yet he never wavered, and in the end, something happened that not even science could deny. He didn't need the world to believe him, he just needed to follow his conviction. And because he did, millions of people found courage in their own spiritual questions. John's story reminds us that faith is not always about answers, sometimes it's about endurance. And Florence Once the Skeptic shows us that it's okay to question, to struggle, to doubt. Because in her vulnerability we find ourselves. Her slow journey from disbelief to quiet acceptance speaks to the emotional conflict we all face when we try to make sense of the unknown. The twins themselves, now adults, have long moved on with their lives. The memories they once held so vividly of Joanna and Jacqueline's lives faded over time, but the impact remained, not just in them, but in everyone who heard their story, and that impact continues even now. Documentaries, articles, university lectures, and online discussions still revisit the Pollock case, not just because of its strangeness, but because of what it unlocks in us, a sense that life is not random. A belief that love transcends time, a curiosity that refuses to be silenced, because if two little girls could carry the echoes of souls before them, what does that say about who we are? What if our lives are more than the sum of our years? What if the people we've lost never really left? What if healing is found not in forgetting the past, but in believing there is something still ahead, something greater, deeper, eternal? The story of the Pollock twins may not be universally accepted, but its message moved the world. It softened hardened hearts, it awakened closed minds, and most importantly, it gave people a reason to hope again. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that answer everything. They're the ones that make us believe in something more.